Hi, everyone. Welcome to this climate communication panel. Today, we're going to be talking about how to have an effective conversation about the climate crisis. So I'm Kate Yoder, and I'm a journalist at Grist, which is a nonprofit media site focused on climate justice and solutions. And I'm based in Seattle, and my focus at Grist is on language and culture and climate. So I write a lot about communication. And I think we're just going to start off with some introductions. So, Saad, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, hey Kate, nice to be here. I'm Saad Amer. I am the co-founder of Plus One Vote, which is an organization dedicated to getting out the vote and improving the representation of young people and people of color in our democracy. I am also an expert reviewer for the upcoming IPCC report and on the youth constituency of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm based here in New York and happy to see y'all from Zoom World. Hello.
Zoom world, I love that. Reverend, do you want to go next?
Everybody, it's Rev Yearwood, president and founder of the Hop Caucus, and glad to be with you this afternoon.
And Alexander?
Yeah, hi, Kate. Saad, Rev. I'm happy to be here. I come from the University of the Philippines, and which has quite a track record in terms of natural resources and environmental science research. And I'm here to bring the perspective of the climate communication science community. Thanks.
Cool. Glad everyone made it. So I can go first, and I'm just going to talk about some of the things that I've been thinking about based on my reporting at Grist over the years. And then I think we're just going to quickly go around and everyone's going to say a few things about just what our approach to climate communication is or projects we've been working on. And then hopefully there'll be a little time for discussion. So what I've been thinking about is just how climate change can be intimidating for a lot of people to talk about for a few reasons. One is obviously polarization. People don't want to start a conflict with friends or family. There's also, it can feel overwhelmingly big. And then third, I think just being intimidated by the science is kind of one of these reasons that people are hesitant. And that's really got me thinking about, what does expertise mean when it comes to climate? Because obviously scientists are experts on the science, but there are also so many other aspects to climate change. So, we're all living through the climate crisis. We've seen how the seasons have changed here in Seattle, like wildfire smoke, and then that's being blown all across the world. And if you live near pollution from a busy street or industrial plant, then you're an expert on climate change, in your own way, because you're qualified to talk about your own life. So I've written before that jargon can be really off-putting for a lot of people. So that's, reading stuff about carbon negative and sequestration and mitigation. I should probably stop giving examples because this is the kind of thing that makes people tune out. So, as the Climate Museum folks said in the last segment, my advice is just to talk to people that about the things that matter to you and how climate is affecting them. And then I'd also like to add that, we tend to hear a lot about super scary climate tipping points with ice sheets melting, but we don't hear as much about these social tipping points for action, which are already happening. I think we've seen the past couple of years. So people are getting increasingly alarmed, as we've seen in polls. And, I think we're beginning to see this beginnings of a critical mass where companies and institutions and governments are starting to flip and make commitments, which could be stronger, obviously. And that's what we need to work on. But I like to talk about climate change in terms of peer pressure and how we can use peer pressure for good. So that means studies show that if you put up solar panels, your neighbor's more likely to also. So we can kind of, communicate also by the actions that we take. And at the end of the day, I think that there's no one right message that will resonate with everyone. It's all about all of these messages adding up over time. So you might hear about climate change on a podcast or in a book, or, a friend brings it up in conversation, or listening to this Earth Day conversation right now. But that repetition, I think, is more important than any one message. So that's it from me. But Saad, do you want to talk about some of your work?
No, for sure, Kate. I think what you touched on was really important in thinking about how climate change is impacting us and how, the reality of climate change is that it's such an intersectional issue. So when I'm communicating and talking about climate change, I really like to focus on not just this idea of climate change in a vacuum. The world is going to get hotter and the oceans are going to rise and that type of stuff. I think we think about those impacts a lot, but it's such an intersectional issue. The climate, it is a human rights issue. We know that if we don't address climate change, and even if we do, there are going to be hundreds of millions of climate refugees fleeing from where they are across the world. Climate change is a social justice issue because we see that Black, Brown, Indigenous communities are going to be hit the hardest by the climate crisis. Climate change is an economics issue because we know that as the world is changing, we're going to see impacts to real estate on the coast. We're going to see many impacts to jobs, as we see right now with many policy proposals to create climate corps for people to be able to install solar panels and go towards renewable energy. We see climate change as a health issue. For example, air pollution is leading millions of people to die prematurely every single year, and in some ways could lead to another future pandemic. And so when we think about climate change, it's really important to think about how intersectional it is, because I guarantee you, whatever issue it is that you're passionate about in your life, the climate change, the climate crisis is affecting you in some sort of personal, intimate way. Climate change is really a democracy issue. My organization Plus One Vote focuses on mobilizing young people and people of color to get out and vote. And at the end of the day, climate change is such an important voting issue to, mobilize young people to get our elected officials out there to actually take action on these issues on a national or international scale and really instigate this type of changes that we need to see, because climate change really does affect all these different aspects of society. I know it's impacted my own life personally here on Long Island in New York, and I think it's important that we talk about those intersections, that we talk about the impacts to people of color, especially in times like this where we're seeing so much brutality against people of color. And I think once we start to understand how these issues are connected, we'll be more well equipped to really push forward that conversation and really instigate real changes across the world.
Yeah, thanks so much, Saad. That's so many great points. And Rev, do you want to go next and just talk about what you've been thinking about or some projects you've been working on?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I just want to thank Saad for his comments. It definitely leads in well to what I think I have to say. I guess, one of the things for me is that I don't want to really speak so much for the broad base of those who may be outside the climate movement, but those who are probably watching this right now, who are within the climate movement. And so I think that if we can do the things to communicate our story better, we could be much more successful. And one of the things for me, this gathering is very important because 4 years ago, when I was actually going to the March for Science in Washington, D.C., I was literally beaten up in the street by the DC police. And I wrote about that in many articles. You can just Google to save time. But one thing about that was interesting is that the officer assumed that I wasn't supposed to be there. That was the thing that really kind of struck me. And so he roughed me up because until my badge, it was raining, my badge, VIP March for Science badge fell out. And then obviously my clergy collar, then he kind of backed away. But what was surprising to me was that all the white people who were at the March for Science did nothing. They actually assumed that I was supposed to be getting roughed up. They just kept walking. And that's the one that hurt me the most, because these are the folks that I was marching with for our planet. So for me, I think that as a movement, we have to deal with the issue of white supremacy. And I think that if we deal with the issue of white supremacy, we can also do the issue of the climate crisis. In essence, saying climate justice is racial justice and racial justice is climate justice. And so I think that we need to communicate that. So one, we need to figure out if we are the right ones who are able to communicate that. Are we the right ones to tell that story? At Hop Caucus, we've been trying to do that. We've done things from podcasts, The Coolest Show, lifting up Black and Indigenous and women of color in a leaderful moment. We've done documentaries now that have been either more serious or comedies that we've done through our Hop Caucus, Stick 100%. And even, ourselves, we ourselves are putting together a panel that we will do on Tuesday called We Shall Breathe. But I say all this because I really believe that our movement has to address the issue of white supremacy. The inconvenient truth that we saw after Katrina wasn't just the climate crisis, as we see even in the Philippines, that we'll hear about next. But the inconvenient truth was also white supremacy, because we saw, for me, in my home state of Louisiana, we saw poor and particularly Black people left behind in the richest country to die. And I think that if we keep seeing Black and brown people on the front lines who are hurt first and worst by the climate crisis, then those are the stories that we have to tell.
Totally. Thanks, Rob. That's such an important point, and hopefully we can come back to that more later. But I'd like to hear from Alexander too, just about your perspective from the Philippines.
Yes, thank you, Kate. I agree with everything you said, Saad said, and special thank you for Rev for mentioning the Philippines and our experiences here. So I'm going to echo what you said, framed differently. You see, my affiliation is with at the University of the Philippines is with a constituent campus called the UP Open University. And a couple of decades ago, we published a textbook called Environmental Communication. And, we've observed in that book that there's not much emphasis on environmental communication or climate communication. For so long, the scientific community has just they classified climate action into two broad categories. Climate mitigation, which is all about carbon, climate change adaptation, which is about resilience and so on. But I propose that there ought to be a third category of climate action, and that should be climate communication, right? Or climate advocacy, which is what Saad is doing and what the Rev is doing. There are implications on this, particularly in terms of budgets or resources, or support. For instance, there are quite a number of scientific research centers in the global South that are doing splendid work on climate communications. Centers such as the Center for International Forestry Research in Indonesia, or the World Agroforestry Center in Nairobi in Kenya. They've tapped social media, they've tapped social networks and so on, culture, indigenous peoples, but their budgets compared with corporate communication budgets that climate deniers use are dwarfed in minuscule. That's what we've observed. And there are other things that I'd like to talk about, but I'll bring it back to you, Kate.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I mean, we've just touched on so many topics and I have lots of questions. But one thing I'm thinking about right now is just, when we talk about how to have a climate conversation, there's this question of, who are you trying to reach? So I feel like historically it's like, oh, how do you, make people stop denying climate change? But there's also the question of, are we just trying to activate, people who are already concerned or worried about this issue and just sort of need like a little push. So yeah, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about that.
If I may go first, Kate,
Sure.
I think the more important question is, when we talk of climate conversations or climate communications, whose voice are we representing? The Reverend Yearwood has described a number of initiatives from his point of view. I mean, whose voice? Is it the voice of the climate scientists or the politicians or the deniers? No rebuttals to deniers. How about those vulnerable communities, those where climate change is currently a reality? The previous segment of Korea mentioned we aren't in their findings and their research. People do not relate much with climate change, but to a majority of the global population, climate change is a day-to-day reality. Like, for instance, a very strong typhoon has entered the Philippine area of responsibility just yesterday, and not so sure what damage this will again, you know, make. Yeah. Is it another thing, and maybe some of you could react to this. When we talk of climate communications, we are forgetting that a participant is the climate itself, nature or environment. They give us, as Maggie said earlier, climate signals or biosignals, and but beyond that, they do not have the agency or the means to communicate other than through these biosignals or climate signals. And I think it's to us to serve as their agents to amplify these signals or the climate messages coming from nature or the environment.
Totally. That's a great point. On one other topic I wanted to turn to was just when the Rev was talking, it kind of stuck out to me that you're talking about a comedy documentary. And I'm wondering, what role you think comedy has in climate communication.
It has a lot. I mean, I think that in this moment of so much trauma and grief and heartache, that we have to remember that we're human. And so when we did Ancient Romance Heat Wave, we did it with the intent of one, telling the story from the people's perspective, but also one where it's not only based in grief. In that aspect, we're seeing so much pain right now in our community. Right now, our community is so hurt right now by seeing literally people being killed before them. I had to speak one time in Long Island, where Saad is out there. Shout out to Long Island, Strong Island, as we say in hip hop. I had to speak there one time, and after I got finished speaking, a young person who was the same age as the young brother who was killed in Chicago, Adam Toledo, he came to me after my speech and said, "Man, that was a great speech on the environment." But then he said these words. He said, "But Rev, why do you want to save hell so bad?" And I had to just remember that to many people in our communities, that this is hell. They live in it. And so I think we have to, when we communicate using humor and love and those things to just bring about that, to bring a little bit of joy, can help them to escape hell. But again, only we can escape hell is as a movement, we transition and we connect the dots that racial justice is climate justice, and climate justice is racial justice.
Definitely couldn't have said it better. And I want to hear from you again too, Saad. I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit more about your organization, because I think it's such a cool concept.
Well, thank you. I think the idea of +1 vote is something that everybody watching this can sort of take away. And that is, our foundational fundamental question is, who's your +1? Who is the one person that you're going to register to vote? The one person that you're going to bring into the movement, right? I think when we talk about communications and advocacy, it doesn't have to be this big grand, I'm speaking on the floor at the UN and I'm Greta Thunberg leading a march or whatever, It's really something that we can all do and take to our own community. And whether that your +1 is your best friend in school, one of your colleagues, maybe your boss, or, an elected official, whoever it is, as long as you're communicating that idea to people to bring them into the movement, I think it really can make a difference. And when we talk about democracy, every single vote matters. Making sure you get out there and voice your opinions and your thoughts by casting a ballot can really transform our elected officials, so we can actually have people in power who believe that social justice is racial justice, is climate justice, and that we need to take action on all of these things.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that's a great point. And I think we have just a little bit more time, but does anyone have any kind of last thoughts that they want to share?
Yes, Kate, I just want to reiterate, I think the climate change community should begin recognizing the importance of climate communications. Make it a third category of climate actions. We're not merely supportive, we are interventions. Communication is an intervention in itself. It's not merely supportive to mitigation and adaptation. That's it for me.
You can check out our demands at weshallbreathe.com. Weshallbreathe.com. And all power to the people.
Did you have any last thoughts, Saad?
Yeah, I mean, right now is the time where we really need to be pushing. We see a lot of changes that are going to be announced this week during Earth Week, which I'm super excited for. One policy I'd love to highlight is HR 1, the For the People Act, which will transform our democracy, make voting so much more accessible for young people, people of color, and really everybody. And you can learn more about that at our website, plusonecampaign.org, or you can follow us on Instagram at +1vote.
Cool. Yeah, well, it was amazing talking with you all, and thanks, and hope you have a great rest of your day. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. I just want to wish you good luck with all your climate conversations going forward.
Thanks, Kate. Bye, Rev. Bye.